I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. And the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you that we could be together this morning. Help us to look to you this morning, not to ourselves. Guide me as I'm speaking, and let me be speaking your words. Amen. So, this past week was spring break, right? And the best way to spend spring break is at the beach. So that's what I did. I went to the beach. But I also spent it with 20 high schoolers who were doing service projects. So it wasn't a typical spring break. There was a lot less laying on the beach and a lot more painting and doing yard work and corralling 15-year-olds. But it was super fun. And we were in Bilobatry, Alabama. If you have never heard of that, that's not surprising. It's really tiny, but it's near Mobile. If you eat shrimp in Alabama, it's probably from there. So there's a fun fact for you this morning. You didn't know you'd be getting that, but it's a bonus. So while we were there, we had 20 high schoolers from Kansas, and they spent their spring break working for different community members and visiting different people, going to a nursing home, and spending some time in worship, doing worship service that we led each night. And our theme was first love. And we used a verse from 1 John that talked about we love because God first loved us. And our goal that we did this past week was to impress upon these students that showing love is incredibly important. And the way that we show love is through our actions and our words and our service to others. And when you work with high schoolers, you can learn a lot. You can also be reminded of how high school was for you if you're aren't there anymore. And there's always like an outcast, right? There's always someone who's kind of on the side, or there's a group who's not quite in the middle. And when we went, we also took the kids to a convalescent home, and you could see that there as well. There were some residents there who everybody wanted to talk to. Right, all the kids wanted to go hang out with them because they had really cool stories, they were easy to understand, and they were just, they were really approachable. But there were other people there who were less approachable, either because they couldn't hear well, or you couldn't understand them very well, or they just didn't seem like, they just, for whatever reason, were less approachable than the other residents. And it's really hard to see that. And it was really cool to see certain students kind of branch out and go talk to them. But it was also, you could see the students that just didn't do that. Or you could see the students that their own friends in their church group would sometimes not include them all the time. And that can provoke a lot of anger, right? Because there's a lot of injustice in that. Nobody should be left out ever, whether you're a high schooler in a youth group or an older person in a home recovering from an illness or surgery or anything. And it can teach you a lot about love, too, because there's a huge value to somebody who's been cast aside when you come in and simply say good morning to them. And that was just kind of a reminder, because I worked for the organization that led this trip this summer, and I worked for them this upcoming summer. And over again, we were taught this lesson. These kids would show us either the abounding love or they would show us how sometimes we fall short. Now, if you read your bulletin, it's also up on the screen, you can see that the sermon today is about anger, right? So, why am I talking so much about love? Well, I knew the sermon was going to be about anger because it's part of the sermon series that we're doing. I didn't have any verses or anything. So I was looking to what Jesus says about anger, how he was angry, how he saw anger and reacted to it, and what exactly that meant. Because Old Testament, God, he's angry a lot, but perhaps that's not the example we want to emulate. There's lots of smiting going on. That's not exactly what we're looking for. So I figured let's go see what Jesus did, because we clearly want to emulate his example. And so I was kind of reading a bunch of different verses with that, trying to see where exactly that went, what makes him angry, how does he respond to that, how does he respond to the anger of others around him. And as I was doing that, I was kind of thinking about my own anger and what makes me the angriest. And I'm like a pretty relaxed person. I really don't get angry that often. I just don't. Definitely working with high schoolers can bring out the best or the worst in you, but I usually keep pretty patient with them. But it's, I just really don't get that angry. But the thing that does make me the angriest is when somebody's left out, for whatever reason. And so I was kind of thinking about that, and that's really, it was kind of the beginning of it. And there's this book that is my favorite book. It's called A Little Princess. It's super old. It was written in like the early 1900s. And it is, hands down, I've read it like 12 times. It's my favorite book. I could probably quote it without even looking at it. But the idea, there's this girl in it, and her dad is, he's a soldier. And so he brings her to boarding school, because that's what you did. You took your kid to boarding school, and then you went off and lived your life while they grew up. And at one point, he dies, and so she is left destitute. She has no money, right? So instead of being this privileged little girl at this fancy boarding school in England, she all of a sudden becomes a pauper. And the boarding school doesn't turn her away. They instead turn her into basically a slave, because they say she has to repay the debts, and they don't want to turn her away because they don't want to be known as the person who cast a little girl out into the streets. But instead, they do something much worse. And throughout the book, the majority of the book takes place while she is destitute, while she is this glorified slave. And her big thing is that she talks about being a little princess. And not being a little princess as in like a Disney princess, right? Not a little prissy, I can do whatever I want because my parents have money, not that kind of thing. But the idea of a princess of the people, someone who serves. A lot of her ideas are similar to Jesus' ideals. The idea that caring for the least and the lost. And one thing that she says, because a lot of people criticize her because she's just different, and that's what happens. And one of the things she says about anger is really powerful, I think. She says, when you will not fly into a passion, people know you are stronger than they are, because you are strong enough to hold in your rage, and they are not. And they say stupid things they wish they hadn't said afterwards. There's nothing so strong as rage, except what makes you hold it in. That's stronger. And I think there's two really important parts here. One, the idea that flying into a passion. Anger can be blinding. It can be something that takes away your focus from anything else. And it can make you say stupid things, as she says. It can make you do things that you regret later, because it blinds you to what you're doing, to your actions, to who you're hurting or helping, or what it is you're looking for. It also has the idea that anger matters, because it's a powerful emotion. When people see that you are angry, it's powerful. When you act out of anger, that is very, very powerful. And this is kind of, I think it really centers on what anger really is. Because sometimes it can be something that it's just like so powerful you don't even know what it is. But here, that power is centered on the idea that is power over others or power over yourself to hold that in. Now I could talk about this book for the entire sermon, but I won't. We're going to turn to a more important book instead. So Jesus gets angry. We've seen this. And the most famous example of Jesus getting angry is the turning of the tables, the flipping of the tables in the temple. Whenever I talk to anybody about this sermon that I was going to talk about anger, they're like, oh, you're going to talk about flipping tables? Literally every single person. So if you're not familiar with it, don't worry, we're going to go through it in a minute. But another part that's inherently connected to the story of flipping the tables with Jesus is the cursing of the fig tree. This is also a wild Bible story. It's very odd. One of the oddest, I would think, in the New Testament. In fact, the Bible commentary I was reading literally said, the cursing of the fig tree is a weird story. One of my friends recommended I entitle the sermon, Fig Trees Are Stupid, but I didn't do that. But it's a weird verse, but it's right next to the turning of the tables. So let's kind of jump into what exactly that looks like. So in this story, the turning of the tables, there's two different accounts of it in the Gospels, and there's different order between the two. So if it seems like I have the wrong order, then you may be thinking of Matthew/Mark, one of the two. But they're essentially similar. So in this, Jesus has just arrived in Jerusalem. It's a triumphant arrival, and he goes into the temple and he causes a ruckus, because that's kind of how Jesus was. He pretty much caused a ruckus wherever he went, in a good way. But he goes in and he flips the tables, and he gets really upset with the people in the temple. And this to us, we're like, they were changing money and they were buying things, and it was just a den of thieves in the temple. And we think, well, duh, of course he needs to upset that. He shouldn't be selling things in the temple. But if you look at the context, the idea of them selling things in the temple had been around for thousands of years and was not the problematic part. In fact, that was business as usual. There were sacrifices that had to be made, and they had to use specific items and specific coins in the temple in these sacrifices. So it was a commonly held practice to walk into the temple, buy your dove, change your money, etc., go to your sacrifice, go worship in the temple. This was not the problem. A lot of times there's a lot of attention drawn into that idea of money, and that's the problem. That wasn't the problem. Jesus goes in here and he talks about Jeremiah. He quotes Jeremiah. And Jeremiah was one of the prophets when Israel was kind of being destroyed. And people during that time were planning to hide in the temple because they said God won't destroy his own temple, right? And Jeremiah came and said, no, that's not what God said. God said he's going to destroy everything, his temple included. His temple is not for you to hide in. That was never the meaning of it. It was never a place for you to shelter yourself from the world. And that idea of sheltering yourself is really the problem here. Jesus also talks about, there's a connection to Isaiah. And in Isaiah, it was told that the temple was going to be a house of prayer for all nations. And in Jerusalem, it wasn't. It was a house of prayer for the elite. It was a house of prayer for specific sects of people. It was a house of prayer for the nation of Israel, not for all people. And this was the problem. And I told you I'd get back to the connection between love and anger, right? So, when I was reading these stories, it really kind of came to be known that love was the answer to anger. That love and anger are two sides of the same coin. And the two greatest commandments in the Bible, right? Love for God, love for others. And this was really what I was seeing where Jesus was angry. Jesus was angry when people loved things that were not God and loved things that were not others. When they loved money or things like that. And in this story, that's exactly what's happening. These people in the temple, they have a love of comfort because it's something they know. They have a love for tradition, which is not inherently bad, but their love for tradition had overridden their love for God. And above that, they had love for the law. this is okay. God gives us commandments and asks us to follow them, but he also says, love me first. Love others first. And the problem at heart here is that they were taking love for God's law and putting that above love for God. They were sacrificing, they were doing all the right things, they were going to the temple, they were following all the rules, but it was empty. They weren't becoming a place for all nations. And that is where the problem was. And this fig tree, right, this fig tree, it's such a weird story. Jesus is like walking and he sees a fig tree and he's hungry. In one of the versions it says he's hungry and he goes to the fig tree and there's no figs. And so he curses it. Which sounds like ridiculously petty, right? This tree didn't have food, so he was like, bye, see you later, tree. But it's bigger than that. This tree is kind of a metaphor. It's a symbol it stands in for the temple. Because God's people in this temple were not bearing fruit. They were sacrificing, but again, it was empty. They had lost sight of the purpose. And it's the same thing with this tree. It was not bearing fruit. It had lost sight of its purpose that God had designed it for. And so Jesus smited it, essentially, as a harbinger of the idea of what's going to happen to the temple if it doesn't start bearing fruit. So that's the most famous scene, I would say, of Jesus' anger. A lot of people are like, it's pretty crazy, he goes in, he turns tables, and it's wild. But really, when you dig deeper, it's all about love in that story. And again, that's not the only time that Jesus is angry. So let's move on to another time. This is an interesting story as well, because it takes place in all four Gospels, but they're all vastly different. And we're not going to focus on those differences today, because they're less important to the point. They're important to other points. But not today. So this story is Jesus' anointing. And it's where this woman pours valuable ointment or oil over Jesus and anoints him. And the disciples are immediately angry that she does this. And they are verbal about it. They say, how could she do this? Why would you let her do this? We could have spent the money from that oil and given it to the poor. And this was really expensive oil. It was 1 year's wages. She spent an entire year's wages on Jesus' head. And his disciples are like, well, we're supposed to care for the people. Why are we not spending that on the poor? And that's not where the love should be, right? Not on the money. And this is kind of an interesting one because Jesus basically says, like, don't help the poor. Not really. He says that I'm here now. The poor will always be with you. And this is not to say that poverty is forever, that we're never above poverty. This is instead to say that this was a moment that you had the opportunity to help someone. You had the opportunity to show love, and she did. And that, I think, is really powerful because there's the idea that you can't help everybody, right? You can't do that. But you are uniquely situated to help somebody. And there are people around you and near you that you can help. And sometimes we lose the forest, we lose the trees for the forest, to flip that saying on its head, right? Sometimes we look at the really big picture and we forget about who's right next to us. And that's what this woman is modeling so well, is that Jesus was with her right then. And so she took action and did what she could. And Jesus is primarily angry because they're criticizing an act of love. And maybe it wasn't the exact right thing to do, but it was done out of love. Its result was love. It was clearly shown that this was in love for Jesus. And they verbally chastised this woman for an action of love. And Jesus is not okay with that either. So this is, and there's another part of this, is that the disciples say they're angry about the loss of money. But that's not necessarily what they're angry about. At one level, they're angry, this is an unknown woman that where did she come from? She may not have been invited. Who knows who she is? And so this is an unknown woman coming and doing something for Jesus, and that's like a threat to them, because this is their leader, this is their teacher. They're just not sure what's happening. They're a little confused, and it's not the norm. So they say that angry is about the loss of money that could have helped the poor, but it's really not. How often do you think you're angry or say you're angry about something, and it turns out that that is most definitely not the reason? Sometimes we deny to ourselves or to others what we're really angry about, and that can be incredibly harmful, because if you don't know why you're angry, you can't act upon it, and you can't work to move past it if it's anger that's not good, if it's anger that doesn't come from a place of love for God and love for others. So what do we learn from this woman? Number one is that serving in the moment. There are people all around you that need help. There is injustice all around you. There are places where love for others and love for God are not the first priority, and that is where you can step in and act. With these high schoolers, what we always impress upon them on the last day is that it's really cool that they came and helped Alabama. That's awesome. These people in this community will remember them and will remember their service. But they live in Kansas. And there's people in Kansas that need them too. And so we want them to learn from this experience and take it back home with them. And that's what I think we can learn from this woman who's anointing Jesus, is that we don't need to worry as much about what we can't help. We need to worry about what is right around us. Finally, we've got one more story of Jesus' anger. And this is when Jesus heals on the Sabbath. And there's two different examples of this, one with the man with the withered hand and one with a hunched over man. And that's all you get. So the big picture thing there is that it's not a life-threatening illness, and it's something they've had their whole life, or at least for a very long time. And the Pharisees, who are the lovers of the law, right, they see Jesus on the Sabbath, a day that is supposed to be completely rest, nothing else. You're not even supposed to lift a finger to do anything. Cooking has to be done the day before so that you can eat the next day. That is how much it was supposed to be rest. Yet Jesus goes and heals these people. And the Pharisees are outraged. This is another place where it is love for God's law over love for God. Because God doesn't want his people to suffer if we can do something about it. And Jesus could do something about it. So he did. Yet these people were so focused on the law that this was an unacceptable movement for them to do. And this is not necessarily to fault them, because part of it comes from ignorance. They were told, keep this law above all else. And they didn't know. This is why Jesus came, to show them and give them this example, that love for God's people and love for God came above all else. And this was how you show it, is that you don't take the law and you don't say, oh, I'm not supposed to help people unless they're dying. You don't take that as the highest letter. Instead, you help the people. And that's what you do. In this scene, he quotes something from Hosea, another Old Testament prophet. And he talks about how God says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And in this verse, he literally means sacrifice. Literally sacrificing doves, animals, whatever the law had called for. That is exactly what he's talking about. But he says, I don't want that, because you have been sacrificing to me. God says, you've been sacrificing to me for years. And it has lost its meaning. Because you've forgotten why you're doing that. You've forgotten that I showed you love and mercy. And that is what you should be showing to others. And he brings this back up because he says, you've fallen into these same problems. We sent you prophet after prophet after prophet, and you've forgotten to love God over loving God's law. You've forgotten to love people above things, above money, above tradition, above comfort. So those are, the main examples of Jesus being angry is Jesus' reaction to anger. There's also other examples and other times. So those are the three we want to focus on because they really show, I think, the idea that love for people is above all else, love for God above all else, and love for people above anything other than that. If you weren't here last Sunday, you might have missed that we're doing a sermon series during Lent, between Ash Wednesday and Easter Sunday, that is the stages of grief. Last week Logan talked about denial, and this week I was talking about anger. And we did this because Lent is a season of preparing, right? We are preparing ourselves for Jesus' death and resurrection. Jesus' death was an injustice. So this season is leading up to an injustice until we know about Sunday. Before we know Sunday comes, we know the injustice of Friday night. The injustice of his death, his crucifixion. And we know that that's coming. And that injustice needs to lead to grief. It needs to lead in turn to anger. Now when Jesus got angry, he didn't just get angry, right? He did something about it. He healed this woman. He spoke up for the woman. He turned tables in the temple as a visible reminder to people that we need to change. And that's what I'd like you to do this Lenten season, the remainder of this time as we're preparing, is to look to injustice and to see how you can bring justice to any situation that you are in, whether it's at your job, at your school, when you're involved in the community, in your home. When you see injustice, it needs to be answered with justice. We talk a lot about anger. And there's three things I want you to remember about anger. Number one, anger is okay. Not only is it okay, it is a natural response to things. Number two, anger comes from love. And finding out that love is good love for God, love for others, or if it's love for something else, is incredibly important. And number three, anger needs to lead to action. Not action in the moment that you will regret, but action that makes real change to move for justice and mercy and to show others love. We can't allow anger for any reason to blind us, because it is powerful and can blind us. We can't allow it to blind us from those that are being hurt and those that continue to be hurt. Instead, we need to harness that power of that emotion and use it to act until we become a church, right? We are the church, not the walls, exactly. It's us, the humans here, that are the church. And we want to become a place for all nations, just like the temple was supposed to be. And so it is inherently important that we harness that anger to become a church for all people, all nations, all fill in the blank. Until we become a church that Jesus wouldn't come into and flip the tables. Until we as a people, as a body, become a place that Jesus isn't cursing any fig trees to teach us a lesson. Feedback as you pray. Dear Lord, thank you for this morning. Guide us to remember this message and use it throughout our week and through this season to remember to love you and to love others and above all else. In your name we pray.
Let's stand and sing the right.